If you're a conservative who's heard the term woke right being floated around, you're being lied to. In this video, I want to define exactly what the woke right is and discuss if it actually exists or not. A lot of other podcasters and internet personalities have weighed in on the issue. And what a lot of people are saying that I'm seeing is, a lot of people are kind of going both ways. The woke right exists, the woke right doesn't exist. But this is very curious to me. I'm really curious why this argument is actually happening. So I want to look at the way the word is properly understood and really get to the bottom of if it exists or not, and then what the motivation is behind this. One popular podcaster recently had a guest on to discuss the historical case against the concept of woke rightness. And they analyzed if woke rightness was a thing in history, and they determined that it wasn't. And of course it wasn't, because the word woke just started being used in the way that it's being used just a few years ago. So there is no historical case that can be made one way or another. Just because it isn't historical doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, the whole thing seemed like a straw man. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to look at history. I just want to look at the definition of the word. I want to use common sense. I don't want to bamboozle you by picking random quotes from historical figures who never said anything about the word right, because even the word right wasn't even being used until relatively recently in history. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to use simple logic to determine if this is a real thing or not, and then why it's dangerous. But first, there does seem to be an apparent inherent contradiction in the idea of woke right, because aren't the two opposites? Because they should be opposites. Woke is typically today used to refer to leftists, to liberalism. If you're a leftist, you are woke. If you're not woke, if you're anti-woke, you're a conservative. And so how can this be that somebody is on the right and conservative and also woke? But I think the contradiction gets at the core of the very issue. The way that the word is commonly used today is a person who is on the right, or who labels themselves as being on the right, who are behaving like a woke person. They're doing woke things. They believe woke things. And the question that we should be asking ourselves is that possible? In other words, is it possible for people to be inconsistent? I think that's what the word is actually getting at whenever somebody uses the word woke right. And I see this constantly. It's obvious, it's unavoidable that there are people who label themselves conservatives who act inconsistently and do woke things. Of course, absolutely. Ironically, the very people who say that there's no such thing as the woke right points to the people saying that there's such a thing as the woke right and calling them influenced by liberalism. In other words, they're calling them woke right. So in the very attempt to disprove the existence of a thing, they're actually proving it. That's very inconsistent of them. There are loads of conservatives who label themselves as conservatives, but they are actually liberal at heart. In the American government, we call these people rhinos, which stand for Republican in name only. The concept exists. Obviously, it exists. And so the thing we need to ask ourselves, and the kind of logic and sense we need to be using whenever we hear people say, oh, there's no such thing as the woke right, is can a person be inconsistent? Can a person label themselves a conservative and then hold the values of wokeness, hold the values of liberalism? Another really funny irony about attempting to make some kind of historical case against the concept of woke rightness is the word woke wasn't even used the way it's used now until just recently, until just a few years ago. What does woke mean historically? The word woke means awake, but that's not how we use it now. We use it to refer to somebody who is a liberal. And so one element of wokeness is, I think, unavoidably Marxism, which lies at the core of one of the big differences between liberals and conservatives in the West. And I think Marxism, boiled down to its very core components, is the idea that people ought to be separated into different groups, where those different groups have different values attributed to them. And often, People are separated into these groups and given different levels of value in order to destroy a certain group. For example, a long time ago, when Marxism was first being invented, although I think the devilish ideas behind Marxism was around from the very beginning of time, people were divided into social classes. And the people at the top of the social classes, the more successful people, were beaten down by Marxism, were labeled the enemy, and Marxism labeled the working class people oppressed so that they could destroy their oppressors, actually to oppress their oppressors, so then they became the oppressors. It's all very hypocritical, just like how Marxism is used today. It is still used to split people up into different groups and to oppress the people you don't like. We saw this very recently with things like BLM. BLM would split people up into racial categories to say white people are the oppressors, therefore let's destroy white people. And interestingly, a lot of people labeling themselves conservatives are doing exactly the same thing on the internet. They are splitting people up into, ironically, also racial categories and saying things like, hey, the Jews, they're the source of all of the world's problems. Let's get rid of the Jews. And you know who else wanted to get rid of the Jews? Hitler. And a lot of these very same people actually honor Hitler. They think he was a good guy. And that right there should just go to show you that these people are actually awful, horrible people. Not only are they inconsistent, not only are they actually acting like Marxists, because Nazism is a lot closer to leftism than it is actual conservatism. But it shows you that these people aren't actually conservative, and that woke right would probably be a very good label for these people. They are people who label themselves conservatives who are undeniably acting like Marxists. Not only are a lot of these people super cool with hating Jewish people just because of how they look or where they come from, but I've also noticed that there is a large tendency for this exact same group to hate immigrants, even legal ones, even people who have legally immigrated to whatever nation you happen to be in. You hate those people. Why? I don't know, just because they look differently than you. That's not a conservative value. That's not very patriotic. That doesn't display a love for your country. So whenever I hear people doing things like this, essentially trying to gaslight the population into believing that a certain thing doesn't exist, what that usually tells me is one of two things. Either they are that thing that they are trying to pretend doesn't exist. So like the people saying there's no such thing as the woke right, maybe they're actually woke right. Maybe they're actually woke. And I think, honestly, a lot of these people, they don't even realize the danger of what they're doing. They don't realize the hypocrisy and the inconsistency. And so I hope the vast majority of people saying this are just doing it out of ignorance. But it's also possible that there are people who are being labeled woke right that are actually horrible degenerates. And a lot of the people saying, there's no such thing as the woke right wants to defend those people. And none of those things are good options. Ignorance is the very best thing to be in this case. But the longer this progresses and the more these kinds of people push the idea that there's no such thing as inconsistent conservatives, there's no such thing as people who label themselves conservatives who act woke, even though they've been calling conservatives for years woke. It's just inconsistent. It's weird. I think there's less and less grace that we can offer people like that who just consistently push the fact that no, these people don't exist. It's like they're being intentionally blind. It's very weird. It's very strange. So all this boils down to, just the whole woke right argument boils down to, are there conservatives who are inconsistent? And the answer is yes, of course. Yes, there are conservatives who are inconsistent. There are conservatives who are probably actually more liberal than there are conservative. Conservative is just a title. Anybody can call themselves conservative, but the way people act actually determines what they really are. And 100% there are conservatives who act like they're woke. Well, that was simple, and you didn't even have to sit through an hour-and-a-half long conversation, which goes to show you that you can, in fact, actually use common sense for these things. Don't let people like that bamboozle you into thinking you can't have opinions about things unless you do hours and hours of research into Marxism or things like that. You don't. You can just use common sense. And so hopefully I've helped you do that. Follow along for more. If you want to support the show and help me to provide more content that can crush stupidity like this, consider subscribing to the Patreon. Thanks, and I will catch you next time. God bless.